Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Clock Tower tent. Now, having spent much of the week worrying about the havoc Storm Agnes could have wrought on our festival, it's a huge relief that this tent is still standing. So I'm delighted to be joined by a man who I'm sure can tell us everything there is to know about the climate and beyond. He is Professor of Global History at Oxford University, where he's also Director of the Oxford Centre for Byzantine Research. Any other academic positions I've gotten?
That's fine. No.
His totemic books, The Silk Roads, A New History of the World, and New Silk Roads, The Present and Future of the World, have been equally feted by critics and readers alike. In 2019, he was named one of the world's top 50 thinkers by Prospect magazine, and that was before he published his agenda-shifting opus, The Earth Transformed, which he will be signing in the bookshop afterwards. But most notably...
Show it to the back.
Oh God, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. But most notably, he is indisputably in the world's top 50 wearers of glamorous, stylish shirts. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome Peter Frankopan.
Thank you.
So, Peter, I'm going to get this the way around now. The Earth Transformed is quite a topic, almost imaginably vast. Was it long in the making, or did you just wake up one morning and think, do you know what, I'm just going to write this?
Thank you. Well, thanks, Natalie. I know how much work goes into festivals like this, and I know that everybody will say at the end, thank you to you and Ian and the team for having us all here. But this is amazing what you've made, and thank you for inviting me and all of you for coming. Historians like, as you know, they like dates. They like kind of starting points. I would love to say that there was one morning I woke up and everything fell into place. Actually, when all I know about books that I've written and things that I'm interested in, are they all trace back, like Brownian motion, back to when I was a little boy. I mean, Silk Roads, I start by saying I had a map on my bedroom wall, and I used to look at the map of the world and realise that, and wonder why it was that all the history I learnt in my lessons was about France and a bit of Germany, not much Italy, a little bit of Spain, and the British Isles, and this huge, vast world. And I suppose this one, it's sort of, similar. I mean, I start this book by saying that when I was a boy, I used to watch John Craven's Newsround.
The backpack.
The backpack. So John Craven's Newsround, I think, looking at the audience, most people will know who John Craven is, but if you don't, then ask someone who's, 40, 30 plus. It used to be a TV programme that had two important things. First, it was a news programme about 5 o'clock in the afternoon that was aimed at informing young people about the world. And that was incredibly important for, I was going to say our generation, my generation.
Yeah, I don't remember it myself.
It was incredibly important for our generation to be that news was something that we could and should understand. But it was also important because all those parts of the world that I learnt about, revolution in Iran, the Khmer Rouge and genocide in Cambodia, what the Soviet Union was doing with its deployment of nuclear missile systems, made me conscious of this world beyond. And thinking about this book, I mean, actually there was a sort of start point insofar as I was invited to the Getty Centre in LA about 9 years ago, and they said you can do anything you like, research whatever you like, but give a topic that you will give a signature lecture on, a keynote lecture. And I thought, look, I've written about China, Asia, the rise of the new world in the East, or the old world in the East as I call it, which is the primary opportunity and existential challenge of the future. You can split it whichever way you want between Saudi Arabia and the Middle East. We're going to talk about the Middle East this afternoon, Russia, China, you name it. But I suppose the other big existential challenge today is not just climate change, but the uses of the natural and transformation of the natural environment, and reflecting on where that idea came from. So I said I'd give a lecture about that because I wanted to learn about it. So that was about 8 or 9 years ago. But going back to John Craven's Newsround, that was one of the key themes that came up on the news often. Acid rain in Scandinavia and to some extent in the UK, chemical incidents at Bhopal and elsewhere that caused devastation. Chernobyl was a catastrophe. And I was brought up in a world where we were assumed that there would be a global nuclear war at some point that would change all of our lives out of existence, but will create a nuclear winter that will make life difficult, if not impossible. And there was a film that I mentioned, there's a poster of it here, called When the Wind Blows, that came out in the mid-1980s, of an elderly, loving couple holding hands, making tea, who are just far enough away from the blast zone not to be killed by a nuclear bomb, but slowly die of radiation poisoning. And as a young person being brought up, being taught that there is ecological catastrophe imminent, so we need to respect the environment, I suppose it's a journey that I and everyone in this room started a really long time ago. I mean, as it happens, when you start thinking about long history, that is it's not completely dissimilar to some of the very first texts ever written, warning of the dangers of behaving in stupid, foul ways with aggression and violence, and what the consequences, and those consequences are ecological ones.
I mean, what I found amazing was how you contextualise this in history. 2,000 years ago, Pliny the Elder famously observed all history is natural history. 250 years ago, Voltaire described history as climate, government and religion, and was very ahead of his time in putting climate first. You begin The Earth Transformed by quoting Voltaire. I was wondering which other writers and thinkers have inspired you to get where you are now? And
Gosh, great question. I mean, all writers. I mean, you know this. You know, writing is not easy. It's a much greater pleasure to read than to write. You know, I mean, I love reading, and I'm very lucky that I'm paid to do that. That's my job, is to go and read. And so I think there's inspiration everywhere. I mean, I suppose I'm slightly odd in lots of, I mean, I'm sure odd in lots of ways, my wife nodding in the front row. But, you know, I'm odd because I like looking for things that particularly keen for things that I don't know. Right? I'm particularly keen to look into corners of rooms that other people don't look at, because I think that's where the only place I can really add value. It's probably not reinventing the Tudors or the Second World War, but it's to think about other regions, parts of the world, periods. And I find that incredibly exciting. I mean, it's like being released into a sweet shop. So instinctively, my answer would be, you know, these amazing authors in the Middle Ages that no one pays any great attention to here in the West, you know, Masudi and going further east, who are all revered and venerated and are Shakespearean in their reputations in other cultures. But I think that there is something in everything, including in things that are not well written. You know, I think the thing I enjoy most as a historian is reading fiction, because I think that informs me how to be a better writer, but also it teaches you how to describe things. You know, Marlon James just now, you know, we were just talking about how do you describe the colour red.
Yeah, that's phenomenal. Yeah.
And we don't think about the history, it's about facts, right, and about dates and dead people. But, you know, you can be inspired by anything. I mean, in fact, here I start with Milton, who's a kind of an obvious reinterpretation of Paradise Being Lost. You know, the theme of what happens if you behave in an immoral way and your perfect ecological envelope disappears. And Milton and others, many, many others, including the Quranic tradition, including in traditions way beyond Europe and even Asia, are very conscious of the fact that God or the gods have created a perfect world, and all humans tend to do is screw things up. Right? And that's the story of the creation of in the book of Genesis. You know, sacred in Judaism, in Christianity, in Islam, that Adam and Eve were put here. I mean, basically, even if you don't believe in religion, don't believe in God, more or less the book of Genesis tells you the story of evolution. You know, God creates something, that's broadly right. Then there are mountains and oceans, correct. Then there are plants, correct. Then the last day, it's like, I'm a bit bored, let's put humans in there. And humans give one instruction, which is basically behave in a decent way.
And listen.
But exactly. And by breaking the single commandment, you know, how hard is it to do one thing right? The punishment of expulsion from the Garden of Eden is very interesting, that it's ecological and environmental. You know, humans then have to scrabble on their knees, they have to try and grow things amongst the thistles, they have to be fearful of floods, they have to be worried about droughts. And that ecological anxiety is something that has parallels in Chinese traditions and Mesoamerican traditions. In the Mesoamerican traditions, where maize is the kind of the food of the gods, it's a very similar story, that the gods are constantly angry with the way that humans make too much noise or are stupid or are unkind to each other, and then punish. And that sort of sense, I think, of what happens if you behave immorally, how does that affect your climatic response, is quite interesting, because it's the kind of dominant signature in, I suppose you could say, in history.
Well, it's deeply fascinating because, as you said, it's so deeply embedded in religion, and there's this amazing connection between climate and religion. Why do you think climate has been neglected so much? Why is it not one of the cornerstones of if you walk through any bookshop, you see books about trade or war. Why do you think that that climate has been neglected in global history? Just as kind of been seen as, we talk about the colour red, it's just been adding colour rather than presenting a driving theme. What do you think the reason is?
Well, my colleagues who work on environmental science would say it's not neglected. But you're right that it's not sort of front and centre. I suppose it's the same way that if you go to watch a play, you're interested in the protagonists, you're interested in the actors. You don't really care about the set. No one comes back home from the National Theatre and says, I don't remember what I was watching, but maybe they said the staging was good.
I know, I saw the Lucy Prebble play. I quite like that.
But that's all that environment and climate does. It is setting a context. It's very rarely the kind of dominant act. It's very rare that it rained a lot and the Roman Empire fell. That's not how things work. But I think it's just because it's sort of in the background. And I just think it's how we configure the world. I mean, I don't know whether anybody here thinks about what the word Cliveden means. Anybody want to have a... Does anybody know?
Well, so, I should know. I'm ashamed.
Well, no, you shouldn't be ashamed. I think it's that...
Well, tell me, please.
Well, Cliveden means a valley between the cliffs. Right?
Oh, well, that's what it is. That's what the Duke of Buckingham...
Right, so this is... The name of the place we're sitting is to do with natural geography and natural geologies. In this particular case here, the Thames formed by much, much warmer sea level, much global temperatures 50, 60 million years ago, much higher sea levels, produce these amazing rich clays. And then in the Ice Age, or set of Ice Ages from 500,000 to 50,000 years ago, the glacial period cut these cuttings through. So this site was chosen because of what had happened a long time before our species became relevant. And so why do we ignore it? I suppose we ignore it because, you'll never forget that's what Cliveden means.
No, not now.
I think what good history does is it does that bit where you suddenly, again, and my wife's in the front row, where you sometimes have to put the brakes on slightly faster than you think, right? That feeling where you think, God, I'm not quite paying enough attention. And I think really good history should have that kind of semi-cardiac moment where you think, it's so blindingly obvious. What else should we think about like that? So I think there is attention paid to it. I think, ironically, a lot more attention was paid in university syllabuses to climate and the environment, the natural world, 100 years ago. Probably it's a bit shooting from the hip. Probably our sort of faith in sciences, our wonder at technology, our assumption that technology and sciences and innovation will save us from problems. Probably that's become quite important. It wasn't just Stalin and Mao and British engineers in India who thought that we can remodel the natural world to suit us. But that's what big infrastructure projects do. That point is to make life easier, if not habitable, in places that you probably can't really survive and live. And I think that because we've got these skills, we don't sort of think too much about that stage setting. But there are lots of environmental historians who do incredible work, but it's just quite hard to jump into the mainstream.
And they're not front and centre in Waterstones, which is... Well,
that's
now.
That's Emma Eubank, my book designer. That helps. But coming to festivals like this is helpful. And I think what I do in my book, all I am is I'm a kind of the blind narrator in a Greek tragedy, or Greek play rather. Why make it dark on a Sunday morning? But just pops up on the stage and says, "This is my family, my cohort behind me. My apparatus of 4,000 footnotes, they're all online. Is not just the right way that scholars pay recognition to each other's work, but it's saying, it's not one person. This is built on the back of huge amounts of work by very, very clever people, including people thousands of years ago. So, I think it is there. It's just sometimes you need that moment to jump through Silk Roads with something similar, to say, why do we not know anything about China or Iran or the Middle East? Broadly speaking, it's an obvious question. Why do we not teach this stuff in schools, Sub-Saharan Africa? But hopefully it helps give a bit more attention to these kinds of things.
So there's something I've been dying to ask you. You just spoke about cardiac moments. One of the things that I was absolutely shocked about when I was reading your book is you say that you describe the collapse of an ice shelf of Norway, is that right, 8,000 years ago, may have determined the outcome of the Second World War. Is that, have I completely missed?
Yeah, it's the problem about writing books. It's this kind of zingy half sentence that probably I wrote, with a glass of wine when but there's something in it, all right? So you've got to bear with me. So, a collapse of a big shelf off the coast of Norway in about 6,150 BC, so about 8,000 years ago, probably triggered by an earthquake, produced a gigantic tidal wave, the deposit of Earth, that swamped the land that connects Europe to the mainland. I mean, to connect the British Isles to the mainland of Europe. Probably what happened was that it produced a series of archipelago of islands that hung on for another 1,000 years or so, which are now under the sea, and it's what's called Doggerland. Nothing to do with what some of you might think it is, but it's not. Nothing
Sunday
to do.
morning?
Nothing to do with that. And I think when you think that through, right, what are the consequences? First, obviously, consequence not good if you were alive at the time. The tidal wave went about 20 miles inland in the British Isles. Always with history, it's about timing. Unfortunately, that because it was late in the year, it devastated all the communities who in Scandinavia typically winter on the coast and summer in the highlands. Because it had come at that time of year, they'd have been there, which is the bad thing, and those people who had survived the impact of the wave would have lost all their supplies, their ships, their boats and their food supplies, so life would have been very, very difficult. But in the longer term, what that impact of disconnecting the British Isles from Europe meant, I suppose, and it's a one paragraph, but I think it's probably, it meant that when Europe entered its proper golden age, global empires and all those kinds of things, it meant that Britain didn't have a land border to defend in the way that some of our competitors in Europe did. If you're France, big country, lovely place to go on holiday, the challenge is you've got long frontiers with Spain, with states in northern Italy, and exposed to the east. And it meant that Britain invested very heavily in its naval capacity, both to protect its coast, Spanish Armada, we know about that, but we developed seafaring skills. We were very lucky that we had oak forests that we harvested well. We let scientists work out our supply chain resiliences, all those kinds of things. We did very good naval training. Best of all, what the Royal Navy did, a bit like Goldman Sachs, is that officers voted amongst themselves who should be promoted. So it was not patronage that somebody who wanted your loyalty would promote you. So we had a system that worked. So it meant that we developed massive naval skills that were best in the world, better than anybody else. And we didn't have to spend so much on our armies. So the British got very, very good at choosing which wars to intervene across the last 300 or 400 years. It was one of our very, very good processes, helped by the fact that Parliament kept taking powers away from the king to stop the king. The key thing was to prevent the king being able to declare war, whereas parallels in France, Spain, etc., went hell for leather, and wars are very stupid things to engage in, as we were talking about just now about Russia and Ukraine. So I think what that did is it set the British Isles in a different military, naval, intelligence, geological connection from Europe. And I suppose if you were punchy, you might make the case that the fact that Hitler couldn't get here without a massive airborne campaign, which Britain would have never been, I think, invaded successfully anyway, but it gave the resilience to the UK, it allowed us to be able to stand back, and that was probably quite helpful. For what it's worth, probably that was one of the things that drove the Brexit vote, that we feel like we're different. And depending which side of the political cloth you are, you can say, well, we are different. Our history is not about people arriving across the Alps and being multilingual. We are very much monolingual in this country, which is a real problem for, again, the last panel we did, not enough expertise in other parts of the world. But it drove the fact that there were longer-term consequences from these kinds of single events.
So I'm fascinated then. So what other seismic historical events did you reframe in your mind as a result of researching this book? Because
Well, so to keep it relevant to today, in 2011 there was an earthquake off the coast of Japan, and we all remember the horrific tsunami that followed. One of the direct consequences of the devastating impact was that, of course, the instability of the reactors at Fukushima. And that provoked a very strong debate, particularly in Germany, around the safety of nuclear energy. And the Green lobby in Germany have been much more powerful than they are here. We have one Green MP, Caroline Lucas, who's now standing down. Green agendas are not what shapes any form of election, probably not this one either, although we'll see about that. But Angela Merkel at the time was struggling with popularity ratings, so she moved into green space and said, I will close down all German nuclear plants by the end of this decade. In fact, they were a couple of years late. They were shut down earlier this year. Germany has a very strong manufacturing sector that is energy intensive and requires energy. At that point, Germany had about 50% energy dependence on oil and gas from Russia. The Germans, in their wisdom, decided the way to compensate for shutting down nuclear was to build a new pipeline called Nord Stream 2 through the Baltic. And I'm not privy to what goes on in Putin's head, but I would be amazed if the calculation about invading Ukraine, where the single biggest economic actor in Europe, possibly the single biggest political actor in the EU, had at that time more than 2/3 dependence on Russian energy. And, you know, as we heard now, the amount of oil and LNG and gas that is being sold from Russia to European clients today, it's measured in the tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars since the war started. So all those things they don't flow back. It wasn't because there was an earthquake. People make stupid decisions anyway. Maybe Merkel would have made that decision no matter what. But there are ways in which that puzzle fits together. And one of the challenges about a book like this is how to insert those kind of ideas without overstating. And quite often books about, you know, collapses of empires, you know, it rained a lot and therefore the Romans didn't have any umbrellas and emperors died. It's quite nuanced and, you know, tricky. It's tricky to do history that allows people to understand what you're trying to say while keeping a little bit of the disclaimer in. But I think that the fact that it fits together like that feels to me interesting and important.
Well, certainly attention-grabbing and made me look at things in a very different way. With this new perspective, would you have changed anything that you've written in your previous two books?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I spent a lot more time thinking about biological sciences, genetics, plant sciences, which I didn't know about 10 years ago. I mean, subsequently, lockdown was great. So, I mean, you can sign on for master's courses I did courses at Wharton on statistical modelling, on quantity modelling, you know, trying to get my maths and my sciences up to speed. As luck would have it, I've got a couple of friends who are geneticists, and I work in a world-class university where there's expertise sitting next to me at lunch of other fellows of my college or the university. Those kinds of things, I think, are the absolute forefront of what being a historian means today. It means writing about migration without being dependent on sources written 1,000 years ago, but being able to look at genetics. And, you know, the way in which that's moving so fast, it's huge. I mean, in fact, this week, for example, amongst the things I've been reading in my sort of spare time has been a new paper published on the origins of rabies, canine rabies. And by reconstructing the phylogenetic tree, by decoding the genome of rabies, you can work backwards to see when did this first become established. And there are margins of error. Looks like it establishes between about 1301 and 1400, give or take. And that in itself is sort of marginally interesting. I'm particularly interested in rabies and its connection to ideas about the supernatural, right? Because rabies it presents in humans with people frothing at the mouth, vampiric type behavior, how people try to interpret and understand things they don't understand. And but as it so happens, that window where rabies becomes established is exactly the same moment where separate work on a completely different disease, Yersinia pestis is the underlying pathogen of plague. Between 1300 and 1330, there is a big bang moment where, for reasons that are not quite clear, Yersinia pestis splits into 4 branches, 2 of which are marginally virulent, one is mildly contagious, and the other one kills 40% of the population in Europe, 40% of the population in the Middle East. Thanks to new genetic stuff, we think now, no one thought it did anything in sub-Saharan Africa, we think population loss, same level, possibly higher, and in China, new texts that make us think that it's probably the same thing. So why do we have 2 of the world's great diseases that are triggered by change of some kind? And the first thing that one will want to look at is, are there changes in the climatography of the world in precisely that moment? And I'm not going to spoil it for people who are going to read, but there are often push factors, volcanic eruptions, genetic mutations, and when you start to see this all put together, so yeah, would I do it differently? Other stuff I've written, yeah, definitely, and I think, I'm sorry to say, it would be even more interesting to put some of those in, but I think that world is so exciting to be in a world where you are suddenly presented with masses of new data, and what makes it really exciting for, I was going to say young historians, but for historians, is that this stuff is new. You know, it is the single biggest revolution in history since the printing press. I mean, I think it's more important than the development of the internet for analysis of the past.
So, I wanted to go on and talk about...
Don't quote me on that, because that would look really bad in a
but I
quoted back to the history faculty at Oxford.
No, but I think, you know, I wanted to talk about, how you research books and archives.
Yeah.
And, so traditionally, as a historian, you go into the archives and you're reading all the stuff, and it's fascinating. But for this book, you had to familiarise yourself with a whole different type of archive.
Yeah.
And it was a much more practical one. I mean, you've like fossilised pollen and ice cores, and those were your archives. It was a bit of a radical departure. How did you find managing that new material?
Yeah, so the honest answer is I don't. I mean, I'm not, unfortunately, an Arctic polar explorer or scientist, but some of my best friends are. So I think you read and you learn, and you try and work out what you don't know, and you try and represent a high-level, world-class research. And there's no difference of doing that if you're writing about ice core bubbles. So, for example, amongst the things there's ice cores in the Antarctic and in Greenland. Also, we have them in places like Grindelwald in Switzerland. If you drill down, this is all done by the way, pioneered by American research post-Second World War, looking at missile bases and putting oil rigs in Greenland to try to see how stable those would be in the silos. If you drill down, you bring out like a giant lollipop, and you find ice bubbles trapped, air bubbles trapped as you drill down. You can date those accurately. And each of those, as the ice melts, they sort of pop like Rice Krispies. I think Rice Krispies are banned, aren't they now? No, Ricicles have been banned. Rice Krispies, anyway, if you know what those are. Anyway, stay on mission. Those tell us about carbon in the atmosphere. They can tell us about impurities. So we know, for example, that the amount of lead and metals that were being made at the height of the Roman Empire in the 2nd century AD, when Rome falls and is sacked by the Goths in 410, the levels of metal production in Europe, we can't tell it's in Rome itself, but in Northern Europe, the levels of metal production from about 300 AD are not re-established until the 14th century. So it's 1,000 years of rubbish, really, in Western Europe. Those things, they can tell us huge amounts. So being able to check the robustness of the data, being able to check just if you've got single signature, do you have parallel calls from elsewhere? They reflect different things. The Antarctic and the southern hemisphere, northern hemisphere track things at different rates. But it's it's not hard to keep learning things. I think it is a challenge for historians to not get stuck by a region or a period and spend a whole career writing about it. And some of the wonderful authors you have here, it's amongst the things I love about your Cliveden writers, they're very versatile. Seabag writing about Catherine the Great one minute and then History of the World the next.
I know.
Or not the next, and it takes years to write these books.
It's unbelievable.
Or Andrew Roberts,
or just a bit of lockdown, like where everyone else was doing Netflix in lockdown, you guys were writing about the Earth transformed or the world, it's quite extraordinary.
It was, if we hadn't had lockdown, it's an awful time, and as luck would have it, I'd been in Downing Street 3 months beforehand warning about pandemic and what was coming. So I felt smug that my advice hadn't been listened to, not for the first time. But actually being static was not a bad thing if you were an established academic with work to write. My postgrads and my PhDs, it was absolutely catastrophic.
Yeah.
Because you're part of a community, you're an early career scholar, lots of materials, particularly if you're working on primary stuff in my world, isn't digitized, so you can't get access to it. We did as well as we could at the Bodleian in producing text and helping. But that period of not being able to travel, being able to be efficient and so on was a boon if you happened to be at the right point of coming into land a big super jumbo, which is what I felt I was trying to do. So I'm embarrassed to say it because I know how hard COVID was for so many people. But the discipline of getting writing every day and reading and so on was, it's a joy. History is fun. It's a privilege to do what I do, and it's not the hardest. It's not that hard writing a book. I'd rather do that than fix potholes or be an MP.
I find it quite hard writing a book.
I can show you lots of things that might be harder. In fact, a good friend of ours, when his kids were growing up, and he said his son turned up age sort of 40, he said, "Dad, I'm a bit bored." And he's like, "Find a way of entertaining yourself." He went, "Dad, can't think of anything." So his dad said to him, "Follow me, we're going to have a great time." Went under the stairs, got a bucket, marigold gloves, said, "We're going to scrub the loos. We're going to make them the cleanest they've ever been." And he said, "You know what, my son's never been bored since."
Okay, good parenting. So, okay, that is definitely one for the book. So, moving on from academia to politics, What do you think a historian can bring to the conversation about climate change that scientists, politicians and policymakers don't?
Well, I mean, obviously the right answer is to say nothing. I mean, history, it's all, as lots of people think, it's been and gone. And history doesn't have to have any modern application. I suppose it's a good question. I feel slightly on the spot and heating up because it's not my job, I think, to insert myself into those discussions. But I suppose what history does is it provides perspective and it gets you to ask questions. I mean, so for example, amongst the stuff, I bring the book goes right up to today, and it's not about climate change or global warming, it's about change in the natural world. Some of the things, for example, I might be thinking about, particularly, if I'm running a pharmaceutical company or if I was an investor, if I was involved in primary health response. We're living in a world this summer where we've seen the biggest heat wave in South Asian history, catastrophic flooding in New York City this weekend, 30 inches of rain in Beijing in 3 days, possibly because of climate engineering by Chinese scientists possibly going wrong, right? There are 52 countries on Earth that try to engineer projects to do with climate science. But you can see the world in which we are living already now with high levels of temperature, 110 million people in America living under heat stress for most of the summer. That produces different kinds of problems. So for every half a degree of centigrade, your heartbeat rises several pips. When you're playing cricket in this kind of heat, for example, I love my cricket, you might want to know about how hydrated you should be, what amounts of liquids you take on and what temperatures. We know domestic violence goes up by 6% per degree of centigrade of temperature rise. We know that pharmaceuticals, for example, antibiotics, pregnancy kits, condoms, need to be stored at roughly 30 degrees centigrade. So it would mean that if you are in a poor household that doesn't have air conditioning, living in, let's say, Phoenix, Arizona, as I know some people live in Phoenix, then your ability to practice safe sex or to control the size of your family is different to somebody who lives next door to you who does have air conditioning. We know that by measuring performance of high school students in New York City, schools that don't have air conditioning produce 500,000 more fails at graduation than schools that have AC, right? So all those kinds of things are useful sort of showstoppers to say, are we thinking about what the world actually looks like? How do we train first responders? I was in Pakistan earlier this year. We had terrible floods that dislocated perhaps 30 million people last September. One of the things is you need to train first responders to be able to deal with survivors of floods, which you don't have. Most first responders deal with heart attacks, all the usual stuff. But if the volume and the ways things change, then you need to be adapting for it. So I write about air pollution, air quality, microplastics. Important study produced last month on microplastics. It's not that hard to understand because of so much of these are in ocean water, in the clouds, etc. All of us ingest microplastics and has a measurable impact on brain tissue and on liver function. That changes cognitive abilities, has all these kinds of things that our scientists, once they know it and have the funding to solve it, will fix. And possibly, if cynical, might monetize. And then one has to work out who gets access to those things. And here in the UK, with NHS, we're more equal than many other societies. But I think a historian then is worth having alongside to be saying, this is what the rest of the room is focusing on. Are we going to have higher levels of sea level rise? And someone in the back going, I don't believe in climate change. And to try to say, this is what happens when things can go wrong. And I think it's just I would say the bonus of perspective and context is what's kind of helpful. If you're able to keep detached and be looking for things that are shiny, and as soon as you say these things, again, I hope everyone in the room thinks that's interesting and important, and that we should know more about them.
Okay, so to put you on the spot a little bit more, which countries do you think are getting it right with their policy, and how do you think Britain's doing?
In terms of
climate change, environment?
Not one of the G20 countries is within its agreements that it made in Paris in 2015. That probably tells you something. I'm not here to take a shot at the current rowback and this government on EVs and whatever. That's above my pay grade. But unfortunately, the bottom line about any form of environmental change, climatic, water is a hugely significant part of it. There are 50 million people in the Middle East and North Africa who don't have access to drinking water. 390 million have scarce water supplies. And in fact, globally, 3.5 billion have extreme and acute water shortage for at least 1 month of the year. And our water consumption, even in the UK here, is due to go up 30% by the end of this decade. So those kinds of things are, you should be planning, you should be investing, you should be thinking. And if you get it wrong and it doesn't happen and there's a lot more rain and we don't need to worry, probably having a bit for spare is not the worst structural decision to make as a government. So I think who's doing it well? I think anybody who's investing heavily in solar. There's very heavy investment in some of the Gulf states, not just for local consumption, but in terms of investment. China installed more solar this year, in the first 5 months of this year, than the United States has in the whole of its existence. It's been very badly distributed across China, because China is a state that is what it is, as they say on Love Island. It is what it is. Love Island comes up every session, right? This weekend.
I know. It seems to be a theme. I think we might have
only 10 years ago since it started.
Yeah.
In fact, there's a good line. I'm sorry, it's a detour. We went coal-free in this country while I was writing this in 2021, first time since the Industrial Revolution, and all the coal production was a good sign. We've done quite well. The European Union, we're much more green. Our emissions are down 40% in the last 30 years. Lots of things to celebrate. When the final of Love Island came on, the surge of people putting on their kettles was so huge, we had to fire up coal again for a couple of weeks. Anyway, where was I? It is what it is. So China, because it's communist, it means everybody gets solar, and then they put solar panels in places that don't have lots of sun, and it's a total waste of time and money. But I think those investments in new technologies, in supply chain resilience, it's important, but it's a story of inequality. So if you're able to afford it, you can beat nature. So Saudi Arabia burns 750,000 barrels of oil per day just to fuel air conditioning in Saudi Arabia, a country that doesn't have a single river or lake. If you've got deep pockets, you can work it out. But the challenges come for sub-Saharan Africa. The challenges come for poor communities, in different countries, depending on what your climate envelope looks like. As it happens, the second verse of the Russian national anthem embraces the fact that Russia's Siberian provinces and permafrost will one day be fertile, verdant land, and that's probably what's going to happen. So there are lots of places that will win, but lots will lose. But the key is that lots of people will lose, and it'll be those who are the poorest and least able to have support. I mean, look at Burma. Look what's happened just in the last few weeks, and those kinds of things, I think, will ask difficult questions for us politically here. Should British taxpayer money or your own personal contributions go to looking after outcomes in other parts of the world where capacity, wealth, ability is more restricted? And in what capacity do we do that? And I think those are going to be tricky for us.
How did you feel? I mean, you've just given us some awful and frightening statistics. How did you feel at the end of writing this book? Did you just feel demoralised about our future? Did you just feel disappointed in mankind, or did you end it, which I hope you were going to say, feeling optimistic about what's going to happen?
Well,
you say optimistic.
Well, in fact, the last paragraph of my book, I say that I'm holding my wife's hand quite tightly, and Jessica is much more positive and optimistic. She tells me to stop catastrophizing. She tells me not to worry about the Russians and if they're going to invade Ukraine, and these things are probably not going to happen, and I'm worrying too much. And I think it is important to be realistic about all these wonderful advances we've had, right? So any woman giving birth while we're talking anywhere in the world has a higher chance of surviving childbirth than at any point in human history, and their child a higher chance of surviving infancy than any point in human history. So there are lots of things we should celebrate, lots of ways in which we made lots of good progress, but I am anxious about lots of different things. One is about as Donald Rumsfeld, the unknown unknowns that we don't do anything around, and pandemic planning is a really important part of that. This summer we've had Zika, dengue and Congolese Crimean hemorrhagic fever established in the Mediterranean, and those are real problems, right? As zones warm up in other parts of the world, the incidence of disease goes a long way. And I write, disease is an infectious disease is a really important part of what I write about in history. I mean, because decimation of populations have kind of unpredictable consequences. I mean, ironically, they can be quite good for the poor. The Black Death, for example, boosts wages. There's a wedding frenzy. People are busy shagging each other because they've survived. measurable. It's not my words, the stats. Well, busy shagging each other, those are my words. But I think the ways in which disease environments shift is key. That was the key to the European dominance of the Americas. It wasn't just because we brought smallpox, which was part of the story, and as you all know that about non-responses to European, African, Asian diseases, but it was also critical in establishing different kinds of crop patterns, different ways in which people ate in different ways that changed life outcomes. So I'm not pessimistic about today, but there are lots of things that I would worry about if I was involved in national security stuff. Volcanic eruptions, pandemic disease, nuclear contact. This summer, the things that I think don't get enough attention is that India blocked the export of a large proportion of its rice. It's a big global rice producer. Rice is the primary calorie for a large part of the world's population. We know that wheat, lots of warnings around wheat, optimal temperature is 24 degrees centigrade. Anything above that, yields drop. A report again in the last couple of months suggests wheat yields might fall by 22% per year. And so global food shortages, exacerbated by Putin in Russia, cynically and deliberately, is designed to put stress on these kinds of things. And I think, what we should be doing about our food supplies, and those kinds of things, I think, require some joined up thinking, and above all, they involve planning. I suppose the reason to be optimistic is that all problems can be solved if you've got enough time and ideally enough money. But if you've got enough time, you can at least brace. And it's whether we think there's enough thoughtful anticipation of what might come towards us. Actually, there will be people in this room who've got very strong ideas about the natural world, including climate and water and so on, and will say science will solve it all, and that's absolutely fine. If they're right, then great. But if they're wrong, and 99% of science and scientists and some of the people, I was in Cambridge last week at the Scott Polar, the alarm bells are significant enough to think, we shouldn't be scared, but we should put our seatbelt on and be thinking pretty hard.
And pay attention.
Yeah.
So one of the things I noticed about your book is that you love a volcano.
Love the volcanoes, yeah.
Talk to me about volcanoes and this great passion that you have, and what drives the fascination? What do you think it is?
Well, everyone loves a volcano, right? I mean, unless you live near one. Volcanoes, from a historian's point of view, they produce sudden change. Volcanoes pump vast amounts of material up into the atmosphere at extremely high rates. That then gets circulated around the world. And in fact, that on its own is not enough to however much is pumped up, that's not enough on its own to massively change climate patterns. The world's global climate system is very complicated, interlocking. But what it does do is that sulfur that's ejected forms droplets that reflect the sun's light back out into space. So it produces impacts on the amount of sun that can reach the Earth's surface. That, of course, changes photosynthetic cycles. That, of course, means that there's less food. That means calorie consumption goes down. Disease immunity is very closely linked to low calorie consumption, et cetera, et cetera. And some of the big volcanic eruptions in history, and I'll do a couple. One, there's a series of three or possibly four in the 530s in late antiquity. And they mushroom together into producing a world that's written about by historians at the time, saying the sun was so weak, although we could see it in the sky, it produced no warmth. Crop cycles failed, et cetera, et cetera. That process is quite, again, closely linked to disease. In this case, probably it's something to do with, because food is more scarce, animals that carry disease and transmit disease, the great Central Asian gerbil, for example, one of my favourite animals, rats, rodents, and all other commensables are pushed closer into contact away from plague foci, carrying the disease into new locations. That helps create the conditions for the Justinianic plague that does something similar to Black Death, mass mortalities, changes economic structures, hollows out tax systems where suddenly there are a lot fewer people who can generate surplus income. People stop building for decades. People turn, not surprisingly, to the divine in increasing numbers of devotions. Lots of churches being built to beg for protection from disease. But then it does things like it collapses trade routes because there's less demand, fewer buyers. People are very reluctant post post-pandemic to spend because they're fearful it will come again. And one of the things that does in due course is that it disconnects Scandinavia from European trade routes. Eventually, about 100 years later, because Scandinavia suffers from heavy levels of mortality, again 40% probably, maybe more, land becomes more or less freely available. So you get a rise over a few generations of a oligarch class, lots of kind of chieftains. And those chieftains are what generates the age of the Vikings. Because when you have men, I'm afraid, it's often the story, with too much land and too competitive with their neighbours and too much time on their hands, they go looking for new routes. And that process of the Vikings, the whole idea of the what's it called, the winter without the year without a winter, the Fimbulvetur, about the Norse and their anxieties about Odin and Thor, Thor Ragnarok. I don't know if that's any of this audience's latest Marvel films with it's all about this apocalyptic climatic freeze. Establishes the Vikings that then sets out their age of exploration into the Orkneys, which might rejoin Norway, potentially, if I read the newspapers right, Scandinavia, and then Iceland and Greenland. And so that's all, again, plugged into that kind of process of detachment. It's a similar thing about 100 years later, where it looks like the new global empire that is going to link all these continents together would be a pre-Mongol Turk empire, which is the kind of, like Genghis Khan, but never written about, really, is the kingmaker in the Middle East, in the Mediterranean, and in the Chinese Pacific. And at that absolute moment of the triumph of what would have spread, perhaps instead of Islam and Arabic from the Middle East into Spain, it might have been Altaic languages and Buddhism that had done that. Likewise, eastwards, there is an eruption that kills an unknown quantity of animals on the Central Asian steppes. And the animals, the horses, the sheep, etc., are the source of wealth, power, textile, dairy, protein. We know one storm in Turkmenistan overnight in 24 hours in the early 20th century killed more than 1 million animals. So this kind of event can be huge. Something like that happens, and the vacuum is opened up for a new voice to come through from the Hijaz, the followers of Muhammad in the late 620s, that takes what looks like a cult with Judaic Christian impulses into something that turns into what becomes Islam. And those kind of hinge moments are not because of a volcanic eruption, but they do play a significant role, because if you're a boring historian, like I think I am most of the time, it's about logistics, it's about calories, it's about disease, it's about water quality, it's around bureaucratic administrations, it's a kind of, like you know as a Cambridge historian, it's the nuts and bolts of history rather than the kind of great men. And those structures can be very, very, very fragile. You know, one of the things I write about in the book is the things that are big are highly risky. They're much more likely to collapse and fail than things that are small and neatly formed. And that too big to fail stuff is quite interesting, both in the past but also in today's world.
So talking about big and small, this was vast.
Yeah, it's too big, probably. Yeah.
No, it's a massive undertaking. What's next for you? What are you going to do next? Are you going to tackle a subject that's a little bit less... are you going to do something smaller? What is on the agenda for Peter Frankopan?
Well, I met Carlo Rovelli, and he said, "Oh, someone told me you're clever." I went, "Thank you, Carlo." He said, "But I've seen the size of your book, and I don't think so." And his book on Anaximander is like 80 pages, and Anaximander is known from a single epigram. And no, look, I'm honestly, despite my shirts, I'm modest and humble. You know, I've had a moment in the limelight because of Silk Roads. And because of this one, I don't feel that I'm driven to kind of go and do something new to show how clever I am. I think it's to wait to find something that I want to write about. I had wanted to write a big book about Russia, but I suspect, unfortunately, I never will, because I can't wait to get there, and I don't want to as well. But I don't want to write history of Russia. I mean, who knows, in 20, 30 years that might all change. But I'm happy doing my day job of my amazing students I have, who, one's just finished his PhD on frontiers in the early Islamic period and adoptions of local identities in the Middle East. I've got a PhD student who's working on pre-European colonizations in the Maldives. And these are incredibly brilliant, young, smart people. So I think that's what I go back to the archives, sitting, reading, gathering thoughts and information, and not coming out of my cave until I've got something worth saying. So I don't feel I'm under great pressure. Also, these things they're exhausting to write. I mean, they sort of knock the stuffing out of you, and it feels like running the gauntlet because you want people to say nice things, you want people to read it. There's the kind of pinch yourself moment when you see people sitting on the bus, on the tube, reading it, and there's the double pinch yourself when someone picks it up in Waterstones, does this, and then puts it gently back and
I don't think that happens.
And buys Natalie Livingstone's books instead in paperback. No, so I think I'm not stupid enough to think that I'm smart. I just think it's, having done China, Russia, that also takes up quite a lot of time for contemporary analysis and being sort of on the fringes. I do quite a lot with some governments or some countries in the world where they're at the forefront of change. So a good friend of mine is the climate change minister in Pakistan. So, those resiliences for health systems, what kind of pharmaceuticals you should have on supply, how you should store them, all those things, to be helpful in those kinds of conversations. But I'm not the principal. I'm there to give a few words to make people think, and then disappear. That's what I think my job is.
So I've monopolised you for far too long, I've just realised. Shall we do some questions? Oh my God, look at all those. Okay, the lady in the lovely yellow cardigan.
You spoke briefly about, or maybe for a second, about agriculture. And I'm really interested in regenerative agriculture and the effects that has on the climate change. But it's like usually a hush-hush topic, and it's not really discussed by governments and the media. I'm not sure, I'm going to read your book, but I'm not sure if you looked into agricultural practices across history and the effect they had on the climate.
Yeah, that's potentially a very long answer or a very short answer, so it slightly depends which one you'd prefer. I mean, look, the role that agriculture plays in... there are so many different things, so I'm going to give you the wrong answer, or I'm going to answer a question you're probably not asking. One is that one of the points of agriculture is to allow, is the close correlation to urbanization, right? If you have reliable food supply, more of you can live closely together. And so, yes, in the domestication of plants back in, the Neolithic and 3,000 or 4,000 years ago and beyond, it's obviously a key part that drives communities being able to live together, and which has causes and effects. It changes body patterns and muscle structures of women because you have to do different things with grindstones than if you're going out looking for protein, etc., etc. Who does what, the deification, all those things, they're all involved. I think that the key today in agriculture is the stability of food supply. So at the moment, we're adding per week 3 million new city residents. And that puts a lot of strain on infrastructure. That puts a lot of strain on water, on roads, on schools, on hospitals, all the kind of obvious stuff. But it also dislocates the ways in which agricultural production is produced. I mean, for what it's worth, I'd probably want to teach children how to grow carrots and potatoes, as well as teach them to decline French verbs. There's no reason why we have to prioritise and credentialise knowledge that looks like what clever people want you to learn. Some practical skills around, healthcare, around, understanding when you're hot, how to deal with it. Those kinds of things is what if I was Minister of Education, I would do. But agriculture, understanding its role in history is an important one.
Oh gosh, lady there.
Given the impact that climate change is having on migration, do you have any advice, without being too political, on how governments should tackle migration?
Yeah, as a proportion of global population, migration levels are the same as what they were 70 years ago. So in 1960, there were, if I get my numbers right, in 1960 there were 90 million international migrants. In 2000, let me get my maths escalator working in my head. Today we're about 247 million. As a proportion of the world's population, because there are so many more of us today than there were in 1960, it's about 3 to 3.5%. And that is stable. Obviously, the quantum matters. 80% of migrants, international migrants, stay in the country next door. So despite what we might think about waves of migration, it tends to be that people who move around the world and settle in new countries do it through visa schemes and are welcomed by their host governments. As it happens, one of Putin's senior advisors yesterday called for Russia to have a massive new plan to accelerate immigration to Russia of populations from Southeast Asia, because Russia is suffering from a chronic workforce shortage, partly because of the exodus of people with college degrees. 85% of those who left Russia in the last 18 months are highly educated. But there will be a competition for workforces in the future. So as it happens, climate and migration, if you read my book, it tends not to be what happens when there's drought or food shortages. People tend not to put their things in a van and travel thousands of miles. They tend to try and hang on. They tend to suffer from famine. Disease tends to establish. Violence is very closely correlated to shifts upwards in climate change. So higher levels of dislocation would be what I would be thinking, rather than mass migration. For what it's worth, the century between 1846 and 1940 was by far the single greatest movement of people in world's history. 150 million people moved, about a third across the Atlantic from Europe, where at that time we think migration was a good thing. We don't like people coming towards us, even though we repopulated the world in Europe. About a third of it in the Asia Pacific, about a third from South Asia in lots of different directions. And it seems that period between 1846 and 1940, you could make the case that was not a bad thing for millions and tens of millions of people. So I'm not scared about migration. I'm not scared about multiculturalism. I'm not scared about cosmopolitanism, because my job is to work on those. And there are challenges that produces, for sure, but they're often not the ones that politicians think about. And if I was to give politicians a free pass on that, I do think it's hard for politicians in the limelight and in the heat of a media campaign to be able to stop and read. I'd want to know what it is that our policymakers, where do they have a chance to get new ideas? It's one of the things I've been trying to do with the Blavatnik. Nairi Woods is the Dean of the Blavatnik at Oxford. She's just absolutely world class. Is to try to find ways to get reading weeks for politicians all around the world to bring to Oxford and go, here is what the latest research is in biomedical sciences. Here's the latest research in migration. Here's the latest research in inequality. And listen to people whose job it is. You don't have to agree with it. But it's hard to have debates where people are shooting from the hip. And to give a very good example of that, in my world of where I work on China, 10 years ago, it was a golden age of British relations with China. Now, everything that we do with China is toxic. And possibly both of those are right. Let's just say I'm not here to take a view, but I'd want to know what knowledge we added in the last 10 years that allowed us to swing from one to the other, and where that knowledge came from. And unless I'm mistaken, that is some amount of zero. So when you make decisions emotionally, you're quite likely to get them wrong. If you make them rationally, you might still get them wrong, but you're less likely to get them wrong.
We've got time for a couple more questions.
Should we do two together?
Yeah, okay. Go on, Peter, you pick.
No one at the back ever gets asked a question. Is anyone at the back who'd like to ask a question? Yes, someone right at the very back, and then one at the front here.
I have read your book. And your book goes back to the dawn of time to talk about the effect that the planet has had on humanity. But if we look at the effect that humanity has had on the planet, we find that there's a significant acceleration, and most of climate change and biodiversity can be attributed not to the Industrial Revolution, but to things that have happened first since 1945.
So I'm afraid we're already on minus 45, so it's got to be a question.
And therefore,
okay,
particularly since the 70s and particularly since the end of the Cold War, now that there is significant ecological understanding pretty much worldwide, do you see that, and given what we saw during COVID, do you see that, in fact, there may be the opportunity for nature itself to reverse the trends,
okay,
which is not necessarily a one-way street?
Okay, great question. And take this one too.
Peter, a company with which I'm affiliated has just made a huge investment in a fusion energy company.
In the Oxfordshire region?
With an eye to have it a going concern by the end of the decade. What do you think about fusion technology and its potential implications for the environment?
Okay.
Great. Okay, those are two tricky questions. Nature...
You're on a clock.
I'm on a clock, right, I guess, okay. Nature doesn't care about our species. I mean, we do, but this changing, warming world and desiccated world, or and lush world, there are places that are benefiting. That's great for lots of different animals, pathogens, plants. It tends to be bad for the ones that we like, that feature on the TV when I was small, rhinos and orangutans and big animals that we like. But if you're a termite, global warming is absolutely bloody brilliant. So I think the natural world wins. It's not about change is bad or good. It's just there's a constant process of change. And it's where we fit into that story as organisms and as biological creatures. And again, it's for what it's worth in history, we are not alone on this planet. And you will go through a Cambridge degree without ever thinking about, or Oxford degree, without going through, Natalie's a very distinguished Cambridge historian, which I keep saying, Cambridge, without hearing about the natural world or other animals. It's about kings and queens, etc. So, yeah, I think that there will be unpredictable ways in which the way we live and the way we change will reshape ecosystems, sometimes without our involvement, sometimes with it. Fusion clearly is going to have a massive impact if you can make it work. I hope you're investing in our, I say it like I'm an MP, I was going to say in Oxfordshire, where we've got a lot of fusion. Is it in Oxfordshire? Oh, damn it, okay. Look, the provision of energy revolutions are fantastic, and they always obviously take away lots of problems. The issue about IP, access to them, who is able to benefit, but unlimited free energy, whether it's through fusion or renewables, obviously is great. It's one of a host of problems around all sorts of other things that I hope you will make other investments into around air quality. So, for example, air quality in Southeast Asia is so bad that it reduces life expectancy by a year and a half, right? So those kinds of things around cleaning up everything, living more sustainably, if you can solve with fusion, obviously great. The geopolitical stuff we can talk about separately later. I know is more interesting. But free, clean energy will help all of us live happier, longer, better lives.
Peter, thank you so much. I hope you will keep coming back to Clifton. It is a joy having you. And I look forward to the next wonderful work. And Peter will be signing his wonderful book in the bookshop. So everyone, start your queue.
Thank you.